What's up guys? Welcome to this part 2 of Beyond Behaviors called Rendering Lists and Forms by Hand. Now that we understand the MVC patterns used in October's backend, and if you're not familiar with this, have a look at the first part of this screencast series and that will get you up to speed. But let's work on our rendering forms and lists. And we do this using the form and list widget which comes with the backend. Now these widgets are utilized by the behaviors to render their forms and lists, and they're portable, so we can use them in our implementation just the same. So behaviors implement actions and Ajax handlers just like a controller would. So let's have a look at the form controller, for example. And if we collapse these methods here, you can see that the form controller brings a create action. It also brings an onSave Ajax handler, which is also available only available on the create action. It also brings an update action with onSave and onDelete as well. And that's essentially implemented whenever you use this behavior in your controller. All of these actions and handlers are brought into the controller and become available. The lists controller is fundamentally the same. So you can see here it introduces the index action, and it also introduces an onDelete Ajax handler. Now, as I say before, both of these behaviors are powered by these widgets. So we'll be using these widgets to implement similar functionality, but we'll be doing it directly in the controller. So likewise, the list controller implements a lists widget, and the form controller implements a form widget. So let's implement the form widget first. And the first thing we need to do is specify some configuration. Now what we do here is we use the make config method, which is included as part of every controller. So we'll pass the configuration path to the customer form fields YAML file, and if we have a look at this just contains the form fields associated to the customer. So you've got the company, first name, last name, etc. And so once we've created that configuration, we then need to tell it about the model that we're going to be using. And so that will be the Acme Formist Models customer model, and we'll pass a new instance of that. And so that way the form now knows which model we'll be using. So it'll be able to pull the relations and everything that's part of that model and use it as part of the form. Now that we have our configuration set up, we can then create an instance of the widget using the make widget method, which is similar to the make config method. So what we need to do here is in the first argument pass through the widget class, which is backend widgets form, which will create the form widget, and the second argument should be the configuration object that we've already prepared. Then we should pass through the widget to the vars array, and we'll call that variable widget, and then pass through the widget object. So this will make the widget available to our view, and we'll go and update that now. So here we are in the update HTML view file, and I'll just paste in some markup here. And you can see what this does is it calls the render method on the widget, and most widgets support the render method, and that will render the form. That's where our form's going to be. And it's also a good idea to wrap the widget in the form open and close tags, so that way we can capture any data that the users input. We've also got this standard button here which is going to call the onUpdate Ajax handler. So let's prepare that onUpdate handler, and what we'll do is we'll just capture the data here. So this post global helper, it's the same as calling this PHP variable underscore post, but it's a bit more helpful than that variable. So we'll capture the data that's been posted back, and then we'll send it to the trace log and then display a flash message to say that the job's done. Alright, so let's go test this out and we can see our form rendered. So I'm just going to refresh this update page. Whoops, I need to save the view first. And then we'll refresh the page. And there you go. So you can see it's rendered the form using the form widget, and it's basing the fields on the field configuration that we passed it. So we've also got the write to log button here, so let's check that out. Yep, so it said job done. So if we go back to our file system and open storage, logs, system log, you can see that it has written all the fields to the trace log. So these are all the fields that will be available to us when we use the onUpdate Ajax handler. So you might wonder, how do we populate the form widget? So the action's called update, so we probably want to update a customer instead of just viewing an empty form. So we can pass through an existing model. So instead of creating a new instance of the customer model, we can call this static method on the object on the model called find. And then what we'll do is we'll pass the ID from the routing parameters or the action parameters, and we'll pass that directly into this find method. So whatever ID is specified here, we're going to find a customer using that ID. So now let's go back to our browser, and you can already see here I've got the URL set up for us. So we've got my controller update number 1. So when we refresh this page, it should display the customer data for ID 1, and there it is. And so the same thing will happen if we write to the log and go back to the system log here. You can see now that it's posting back the populated data. So that's much more useful, especially for updating things. So that's pretty straightforward, and we've essentially created the same functionality of the form controller, the update action of the form controller. It's a bit more simplified. I mean, the form controller does a little bit more. It handles things like nested form fields and things like that. But here we're just showing a simple example of how to render a form and how to capture that data. So let's move on to the list widget. And so implementing a list widget is fundamentally the same, except we're going to include the list widget on the index action of the controller. So you can see here we're doing the same thing. We're using make config, except we're passing through list columns instead of form fields. And we're also specifying the model that we'd like to use, and instead of making the form widget, we're making a list widget instead. Now it's actually called a lists plural widget because in PHP the name list is actually reserved, so you can't use that as a class name. So that's why in October it's called lists instead of list. And so just like before, we're going to pass the widget through to the variables and make it available to the index view file. Now let's create that index view file. So we'll go new file and we'll call it index.html. And here we're just going to simply just say render on the widget. We don't need a form or anything because lists are quite simple. And so let's go and have a look at this. And there you can see that it's now rendered a list of all our customers. It's pretty straightforward. And this is the functionality of the lists controller implemented in roughly 4 lines of code. What you will notice though is when you click on the first name here and try to sort by the first name, you'll see it's throwing this error saying that a widget called list has not been bound to the controller. And the reason we're seeing this error is because widgets themselves can introduce Ajax handlers into the page lifecycle. But the controller itself needs to know about that. So there's one more thing we need to do here. We need to say that once we've created our widget, we need to tell it to bind to the controller. And so that's just a method called bind to controller. And so what this does is it tells the controller about the widget and all its handlers, and it registers them so they become available. So now you can see when we bind it to the controller, the sorting behavior now works. It's important to note that when you bind the controller, it has to be done inside the action or inside the constructor because it needs to occur early on in the page lifecycle. You can't bind to a controller, say in a view. That's too late in the lifecycle and the Ajax handlers won't be registered in time. Now let's introduce one more piece of config, and this is called record URL. And what this is going to do, it's going to marry up the list with our form. So for the record URL of each item in the list, we want the URL to be acme formist my controller and then refer to the update action and also pass the ID of that record so we can capture it in our update form. So that'll bring those two forms together. Those two widgets, it'll bring those together. So if I refresh, now you can see this becomes a link, and when we click the link, it takes us to our form. So it's pretty straightforward. And now we have a simplified version of the form controller and list controller. So hopefully we've demonstrated that behaviors themselves are quite useful, but they're not necessary every time. If you have a custom workflow or a custom form that you need to render, you don't necessarily need to use the behaviors. You can leverage the existing widgets, just like a behavior would, and render whatever you like and capture that data and do whatever you like with it. You might even like to create your own behavior that has a more specific, a specific function, because the current behaviors that ship with October are designed to be generic and they're supposed to cover all scenarios. But there are certain edge cases where they're not suitable, and you might want to create your own list widget or your own form widget to meet the requirements of your project. So that's everything for this screencast. We've covered rendering forms using the list and form widget, and hopefully that should make sense. The content here is, I guess, of an intermediate level. In the next screencast, I'll show you how to mix the relation behavior with some custom actions and Ajax handlers. So I will see you in the next screencast. Goodbye.